Welcome to the next pillar in our conversation. That is water and irrigation. Now you might ask yourself, why would I put water as pillar number 2 instead of seeds and seeding? Well, that's because water is arguably one of the most important parts of your garden. If you don't have access to consistent water, you won't have the garden that you really want. Within this pillar, we're going to talk about a few different types of things. We're going to talk about overhead irrigation, drip irrigation, how to keep up with a plan, and we're going to have a little bonus for you, which is something called fertigating, and we'll get to that later. But I want to start with overhead irrigation, and there are so many types of overhead irrigation out there, but it all essentially does the same thing. It mimics rain. If you think about how rain falls to the ground, it's coming from the sky. And so the purpose of our overhead irrigation is going to be to take water that is in the ground or at a source, put it into the sky and let it fall to the earth. Doing that does have some drawbacks, but I believe it has many more advantages than it does drawbacks. Here are some pros and cons that I've identified. It gives you more consistent water over a given space. If you have a drip irrigation system, for instance, you do get water right at the ground level, but you don't get the type of water that is needed for germinating a nice bed of baby greens, or if you want to water your whole garden at once, or a good section of it at once with the same kind of water from overhead, you don't get that with the drip system. Also, you tend to have less materials in the field. You can put greater amount of water onto your field with fewer amounts of sprinkler heads versus the amount of drip equipment needed. Also, the water coming out of the sprinklers applies to the ground and over where you're trying to water quicker than drip irrigation does. It's also easier to cultivate your garden if you want to pull weeds, or if you want to use a hoe to scratch up the surface of the soil. If you've got a lot of drip lines in the way or other things in the way, it can be kind of difficult, and you have to move those things and then move them back. With overhead irrigation, you can just leave it in place and do what you need to do with the weeds. One other advantage is it cools the garden down very quickly. When you put cool water coming from the ground out into your field, it can drop the temperature, which is a good thing in most cases. And it can also help from preventing frost damage. If you have tender flowers or fruits and it's in danger of freezing, you can spray a nice small drops of water over the area, and it will actually freeze on the flowers and the fruits, protecting it from frost damage. Now, there are some cons. The equipment can be more expensive. Depending on which direction you decide to go, some of these sprinkler heads and pipes can be quite pricey, but there are other options as well. The water does drop on the leaves of the plants, which can increase the risk of disease and create a little bit of upsplash from the soil, from the water hitting the soil and splashing up to the plants themselves. Is a little bit less economical if you're paying for water, if you're on a metered source that you're being charged for. Spraying all this water over your garden can end up being quite expensive. So that's another thing to really consider when thinking about how much you're going to water or what kind of watering system that you're using. It also requires more pressure than drip irrigation systems. For instance, if you don't have the amount of pressure needed to spray water out of a certain head, it's not going to spray, it's really just going to squirt, and that's not what you want. So considering all these things, we're going to go ahead and dive in. Now, I want to start by talking about the different types of overhead irrigation spray nozzles. It's important to understand a crucial concept here is that there are so many different types of spray nozzles. Each manufacturer has their own proprietary technology, or technology they think is proprietary. It really does one basic thing, which is get water on the ground. Now, you have a lot of leeway here, a lot of room to experiment what you think is the best, or the kinds of droplets you like, the amount of the size of the water drops, the angle that it hits the ground, and there's all kinds of different ways to go. But there are a few different types of heads, and so when you're at the store, when you're on a website, when you're looking for irrigation heads to buy, it's important to identify what it actually is so that you can know if it's going to work for your space. So we're going to start with this guy right here. This type of head that I've got on this side of the table is called a rotary head. And what it does is it uses water pressure to shoot up into this piece of equipment right here. And it actually uses the water pressure to raise this up out of the canister and rotate the head itself. There's a little mechanism inside that uses the water as it comes out to continue to rotate. And they make tools where you can adjust the range of rotation. This is really commonly found in the landscaping industry, not so much the farming industry. One thing is because of it's not very versatile. So this is meant to be buried, and once you put it in the ground, you kind of have to leave it there versus some of the other types where you can move them around and take them down and store them really easily. So if you've already got these and you have a lawn sprinkler system in place and you want to replace your lawn with food, these are just fine to use as long as you know how to use them. One thing to consider is these will shoot water out at more of a straight angle, and so it's not going to be much of a rainfall type angle. It's going to be more of a coming directly at the plant. And because of that, it might be a decent idea to unscrew this from the ground and put it up on a riser, a PVC riser, that's going to get it up off the ground a little bit. That will make the angle of the water come a little bit better. This is very similar. It's just something I bought at the store, and it rotates based on the water that's being pushed into it. So as water's going, it has a mechanism inside that's going to let it rotate, hence the name rotary. These come with a thread here, so they can be put onto either a spray stake like this. You can stick it right in the ground, hook your garden hose directly to it, screw this on top. We also have the same situation with these right here. This is called a MegaNet sprinkler, and these are the kinds of sprinkler heads that I use on my farm. They're cheap. They work really well. They don't break very often. They also use a mechanism to let this rotate in a full 360-degree angle. You can put them up on stakes like this guy. See, it's got a nice long stake that you can just kind of move them around, and if you want to rotate your irrigation, if you want to have a way to have sprinkler heads here and then move them and have them there and rotate them all around, this is a really good option. But this can also be put into a stake like that. Most of these irrigation heads are going to have, these spray heads are going to have a 1/2-inch thread that can be threaded into a stake in the ground, or one of these fancy little tripod mechanisms where you can just thread that right in there and hook your water hose right here. These legs go out, and this is another really great way. It's a lot more expensive than just these little stakes, the little rods that I have, these risers that I use on my farm, but it also is very versatile. It'll last a long time. So those are our rotary heads. Again, the concept is the same. Water flows into them, and there's a mechanism inside that causes them to rotate. Now, they differentiate themselves from a molded spray head in that the molded spray head is a piece of plastic that is shaped in a certain way so that water flows into it and it sprays out in a certain pattern. Now, this is an example of that. This is another landscape application. It does not rotate, but it maintains one position. There are other heads that do the same thing, more of an agricultural application, but they're not going to rotate at all. They're going to spray in one direction. You don't typically find these in agricultural applications because in agriculture, you're going to be focusing on spraying a wide swath of crops or ground or a space. This is better for, in the ground. You have a group of shrubs. You want to water that specific shrubs or bedding plants, and this is really all you need. The next type is a spinning molded spray head, and it is basically just there's a product on the market called a wobbler. Now, when I'm referring to the wobbler, this is what I'm referring to. It's got the 1/2-inch threads, just like all the other heads. It's a simple stream of water that goes through this nozzle. It hits this pre-molded form right here, and the velocity of the water coming off of these pre-molded forms are going to spin this head, and it's going to wobble like that. It shoots the water at a really high angle, comes down really great, just like rainwater. Very maintenance free because all it is a spinning piece. It's just one nozzle coming out. Really, really effective and really, really great. Readily available on the internet. wonderful tool. In the same vein, we have the mini wobbler, and this is more akin to the micro spray, which is going to be a smaller droplet, smaller stream of water hitting the same type mechanism that's going to shoot the water out and provide for a miniature droplet to provide more of a mist, more of a light rain. So good for newly direct seeded crops or things that you want to have not so heavy of a drop come down on. Either way, you can't go wrong. Wobblers are awesome. I highly recommend them, and they're easy to find. We now move on to the third type, which is a micro spray head. And this is very similar to the molded spray head, and it spins. So the water goes up through this pipe, it hits a certain mold, and it starts spinning. And it spins very, very fast, and it makes the water droplets very, very small. Because of that, this is really great for applications where you've seeded fine seeds, little tiny seeds, and you don't want to make a big splash. This can be a really great tool for using that. They also have these, and I got this at a hardware store. It's the same basic concept. This is by a manufacturer that manufactures irrigation for farms. This is one for that manufactures irrigation for homeowners and just the normal garden around the house. But essentially they're the same thing. You have this spinner, you have this that plugs in to your pipe, and then you have the stake. Our last type that I want to talk about is going to be an impact head. And it's called an impact head because as water comes into this spray head, it's going to shoot a stream out right out of this little orifice right here, and it's going to hit, this is going to rotate, it's going to hit this piece and it's going to move it. And as it comes back, it's on a spring, and as it comes back, it's going to rotate a little bit at a time until it hits a certain spot, and then it's going to rotate the other direction. This is called impact because as it comes out and it sprays this little swale looking thing, it's going to spread it out, and the impact is going to break up the stream of water, so it's going to allow it to be more fine droplets, and it's going to help rotate the irrigation head as well. They make them in steel, or cast iron rather. They make them in plastic. They can be pretty cheap. You can adjust them based on where you want them to go. These are a really good option. The other thing about these though is that they are going to also spray at more of a straight angle. So it's best to put these up on a riser like this. This actually came with this riser. Fits very nicely inside of it. You can also take this off of the spray head you can take the spray head off of the stake here, and if you were to have this equipment, you could put it directly onto here. So they're very interchangeable, they're very universal. We're going to put links in the notes of where you can find all of this stuff. You can find it at your local hardware store, the big hardware stores. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what type of spray head you use, as long as you're using something to put water on your garden. Now that we've talked about the different types of irrigation heads, I want to introduce you to a concept of building your irrigation system. And this is something where I'm not going to really talk about the nuts and bolts of how to put pipes together and what different pipes you should use and things like that, because it's so open-ended. There are so many different types of fittings and pipes. It kind of comes out in someone's personality what kind of pipes they like to use and what kind of fittings they like to use and the materials they like to use. So you really have three basic and fundamental parts of an irrigation system. You have your source, you have a transfer or a way to get water from the source to your final destination, and you have your output, which is your final destination. The source typically comes in a couple of different forms. One is either a spigot right there on your house where your water comes out, outdoor spigot. The second comes in the form of a PVC pipe coming off of a well that's in the ground. Now, if you don't have a well and you're running it off your house, keep in mind the amount of water that's going to come out of your spigot is typically going to be less than the amount of water that's going to be coming out of a well. So if you're trying to irrigate a large area, I would recommend digging a shallow well, or a well doesn't necessarily have to be shallow, but digging a well, an external well outside the house that you're not going to use for drinking water or not going to use for anything in your house, just for your garden, it's going to pay off in the long run because you'll have a lot of pressure, you'll have plenty of water to water what you need to do, water. So regarding the source, one helpful bit of information to learn about your source is the flow rate or the output of your water. And this is typically rendered in a metric called gallons per minute, or GPM. In order to figure this out, you can do a simple test. You take a 5-gallon bucket or a 1-gallon bucket, and you're going to take a water hose, a short water hose preferably, and you'll plug it into your spigot, you'll turn it on, and you'll set your timer. You'll fill that bucket up, and you're going to time how long it takes you to fill up that 5-gallon bucket right there at your water source. Once you have that information, you're going to take the amount of seconds that it took to fill up 5 gallons, and you're going to divide that by 60 seconds. So if it took you 1.5 minutes to fill up 5 gallons, then you're going to divide 90 seconds over 60 seconds, and that's going to give you 1.5. You're then going to divide your number 5, because you've made 5 gallons per minute. You're going to divide that by that number. So you would divide 5 divided by 1.5, and that's going to give you a certain rate. That's going to be a pretty low flow. If it only takes you 30 seconds to fill up 5 gallons of water, you're going to divide 30 by 60, that's going to give you 0.5, and you divide 5 by 0.5, and that's going to give you a certain rate of flow. Now, it's important to retain that information, okay, because what we're going to do is, once we get our transfer pipe put down from our source to our garden, we're going to take that same measurement. We're going to try to see how much flow has been reduced from where your source is to where your garden is, because it will be reduced. When you push water through a pipe, the friction of the pipe is going to decrease the amount of flow that you have available. Now, do the same thing again. Fill up your 5-gallon bucket, divide the amount of seconds it takes to fill it up by the amount of seconds in a minute. Then you divide 5 by that number, and that will give you your rate of flow. Let's retain that information. We're going to come back to it later. The next part of an irrigation system is your transfer pipe. And the transfer pipe can come in all kinds of different forms. You can use a PVC pipe, which is a rigid plastic pipe, and it comes in usually Schedule 40, which is a thick wall, or a thin wall type, which is used a lot for irrigation purposes. Either will do. Usually if you get a certain larger diameter, you can only find the thick wall stuff, but thin wall may be available. You can use this type of pipe, which is available at a lot of agricultural supply stores. This is called a lay flat hose, simply because when there's no water in it, it lays flat. When there's water in it, it rises up. With PVC pipe, a lot of times it's a good idea to bury it, but you don't have to. If you do bury it, you won't have to worry about it freezing. If you don't bury it, it's just fine as well. You just are going to run over it every time you drive there or walk there. You could trip. This is a little bit easier if you're going to be driving over top of it. It just crunches right down and then comes right back up. This is plastic. It's reinforced with a fiber, so it's very strong, can hold a lot of pressure. You also have this type. It's a little bit of a thinner pipe. This specific one is called an oval hose, but it's essentially a piece of plastic. It's a plastic pipe that's got not as thick of a wall as this or this, so it doesn't hold quite as much pressure, but it's a good option for different types of applications. You have this type of poly hose, which is a more rigid plastic pipe, very similar to this. These come in all different diameters. I like using 1.5 and 1/2 inches. They also make 3/4 inch and 1 inch. Like I said, it doesn't really matter what you use as long as you're using something to get water from point A to point B. Now, to put all these pieces together, there's many different options. We have for putting a lay flat hose to a lay flat hose, or a lay flat hose to a poly pipe like this. They make fittings that fit over top of each other. And we also have something called a hose clamp, which will quickly become your best friend when you're building irrigation systems. Hose clamps are simply this is also going to become your best friend. This is an electrician's universal screwdriver, but it's got the right kinds of fittings to be able to use in a lot of irrigation settings. So I actually like using electrician screwdrivers because they're really well made. and you can use them in irrigation settings. So this is called a hose clamp, and a hose clamp will basically fit over top of this barb, and it will clamp down on whatever hose that you've slid over top of it, putting pressure on it and holding it in place. And you might be thinking to yourself, there's no way that's going to hold. Well, it holds. They really have designed these well. They know what they're doing, and it does a good job of holding in place. They make the same thing when you are dealing with these smaller pipes. This is a 90-degree bend, and we have hose clamp. They clamp it. It's very similar to this. It's just smaller. One question is really, how do you get water from the source into your transfer pipe? Now, there's an amazing amount of fittings that can do this for you. If you have a PVC pipe coming out of your well, you can use a fitting kind of like this, where you have a slip fitting into a valve, very similar to this. So you can put a PVC pipe coming into here, and then take a fitting situation like that, screw this in place with a good amount of Teflon tape, and now you have it, which reduces down to, this is a 1 inch, but in your case you could use either 1 inch or a 1/2 inch, however you want to do it. In the same situation, if you had a PVC pipe laying on the ground and you wanted to connect this into the PVC, so you cut the pipe in two, and then you'll glue them into this right here. You could take a PVC pipe coming out of it, put it on top, and now you have the ability to plug in directly. You could lay this on the ground, you could put it up facing, if it's in the ground, you can come directly out of the ground. So there's all kinds of different ways to do this. And we're not going to get too much into that because we'll get lost in all the different ways to do it. But essentially, you want to take water from your source and you want to put it into a pipe. Now that pipe, this is important to remember, the bigger you can make the pipe up to a certain point, I wouldn't go much past a 2-inch pipe, but the bigger you can make the pipe, the easier the water will flow to your destination. If you put it directly into a small pipe, you're going to decrease your flow even more than if you put it into a big pipe and let it flow there and then reduce it to a small pipe. If your only option is to have a garden hose, if you have a long enough garden hose, you can plug a garden hose directly into your spigot and run it to your garden. That's not a problem. Keep in mind, you're going to lose some pressure when you do that, or you're going to lose some flow. And it's very easy to step from a garden hose, which is this fitting right here, into a hose barb that will connect directly into this pipe here. So as far as connecting from types of pipes to types of pipes, there are a lot of different options. It's very easy to do. Even if you're at the store and ask somebody, hey, I have this issue, I have a garden hose, I need to get it to this type of hose, you can bring it into the store with you. They should be able to help you there as well. Now, when it comes to connecting whatever type of pipe you have to whatever type of pipe you have, there are a lot of different options. We're not going to really talk through a lot of that because it's fairly simple. If you go to a store, you can even bring your 2 pipes that you've got, a little sample of them, and say, hey, I need to get this into this, and they should have plenty of fittings to help do what you need to do. We'll also put a little bit of a guide, build a little list with links of where you can find these different types of pipes in the notes section. So once we have got from our source into our transfer pipe, the water is now flowing to our garden, okay? The next thing that we have is within the transfer pipe section, we have the supply line. So let's call the supply line the line that's going to get your water from your source to your garden. Once we're in the garden, I really like laying out what's called a header pipe. And that's going to be a pipe that's going to go along the edge of your garden, right where the beds start. That gives you sort of a starting point for your irrigation lines to go into your garden. I use this poly hose to do that. You can use this lay flat hose to do that as well. Poly hose is a little bit easier to work with, and I find that it is more than adequate. The other advantage is that if you want to eventually make it into a drip irrigation system, you cannot plug drip irrigation fittings into this lay flat hose, but you can plug irrigation fittings into this poly hose. So we have our supply line. We've gotten our water from our source to our garden. Then we have our header pipe, which now is extending along the length of the garden. From there, we're going to have our lines that are going to run into the garden, and we're going to be able to connect our sprinkler heads into those pipes. So we have source, supply line, header line, and then our actual sprinkler lines. Now, the sprinkler lines, typically I use a 1/2-inch pipe. This is plenty adequate to be able to plug sprinklers into. If you are using an impact head like this, even if you're not using an impact head like this, there's a couple different ways. This is the bottom of this stake that I had earlier, this metal stake. So this right here is a way that is pretty simple to do. These fittings you can find at major hardware stores, and this is simply a plastic threaded piece that has a barb on it that I've put a hose clamp on to get into this hose, which is then going into this sprinkler head. So you can splice this, cut this in half, put this right in the middle of it, put some hose clamps around it, and you have easily put water into this line, and then you have that sprinkler connected. If you don't want to cut your pipe and you want to make it a little bit simpler, there are other options. This right here is a hole punch, and this hole punch does a very good job of what it's named after, punching holes. They make a type of a barb that fits into these pipes or these pipes, any plastic poly pipe. And this barb right here is just a compression fitting. So if you take a hole punch and you wanted to punch it into this pipe right here, kind of give it a twist, poke that hole. This guy, having a barb right here, will just push right into that, snaps in, and then you're free to then put this fitting into there. And you might say to yourself, well, that's not very secure. It hasn't come out in all the years that I've ever used it. So occasionally you'll get one that pops out, but you can just pop it right back in, even when it's running. So pretty simple to connect that irrigation head right here. The other beautiful thing about having a functional system like this is, let's say you set your irrigation system up and you notice after running it, well, there's really not enough sprinkler heads. I need to add one, or I need to spread them out a little bit, or I take them away. You can do that pretty easily with this type of pipe. You can just pop the pipes out, put the goof plugs in, rearrange it. If you have a more rigid style irrigation system, like made out of PVC pipe or anything else, or if you have to splice and crimp your barb pieces in place, it's going to be a little more difficult to do that. So I recommend, if you're going to grow stuff in your garden that's going to be a decent size, use these pipes, the ones that have the barbs on them that you can just plug in. It's going to make it a lot easier on you. You don't have to do it this way. This is the way I like to do it. I'm going to tell you where you can find all these things in the notes section. They're pretty cheap. You can get a lot of them. They come in usually packs of 10 or 20. You can build a whole irrigation system based on that method. Now, these sprinklers right here, these micro sprays, they also plug into these pipes. You just have to punch a smaller hole, and they do make smaller hole punches, and these just pop right in there. And so essentially, once you have your lines, their sprinkler lines, you can just pop these things into place, which I think is really convenient, because if you space them out correctly, you pop them into place, and let's say you make a mistake. Well, instead of having to re-splice it with something like this, which can fix the cut that you've made, but you need 2 hose clamps, these guys right here are called goof plugs, and the goof plugs actually fit right inside of these holes, and they will stop the water from coming out. Most of the water. They're not a complete watertight seal, but they do work very well. Sometimes hard to put in, so there you go. They make them in that size, they make them in this size, and these are usually the 2 sizes that are most widely used. So it's very versatile. If you make a hole, you don't want that hole there anymore, put a goof plug in and move on. Put a new hole in your pipe. That is essentially it. That's how you get water from your source. You have to transfer it to your garden. You have to lay out the irrigation in your garden and plug your sprinklers in. Now, where do you put your sprinklers? Well, that is actually a function of that first measurement that we took, the gallons per minute. Because each one of these types of heads is rated for a certain gallons per minute. Specifically, this guy right here is rated for 0.88 gallons per minute. So if you know that you have at your water source, at your garden, if you have 8.8 gallons per minute, or let's just say 9 gallons per minute, you know that you can run 10 of these heads at one time, because 9 gallons per minute, 0.88 gallons per minute times 10 is going to be 8.8 gallons per minute, which is pretty close to 9 gallons a minute. You don't want to go too low. So if you had too far under your gallons per minute. So let's say you have 10 gallons per minute at your source, at your water, at your garden. If you were to install 15 of these things, you would end up with something like 14 gallons per minute or something like that. Now, if your output is 14 gallons per minute, but your source is only 10 gallons per minute, then what's going to happen is the water's not going to shoot out of here hard enough. Because of that, it's going to just kind of squirt. And what's going to happen is you're just going to have an under-functional irrigation system. I want to illustrate something to you. If you know what it's like to have a garden hose in your hand and put your thumb over the garden hose, if you don't have your thumb over the garden hose, it just comes out nice and easy. Well, when you do put your thumb over the garden hose, it sprays a really long distance. That's because what you've done is you've decreased the flow. And what these heads are doing is they are decreasing the flow from your 10 gallons per minute to 0.88 gallons per minute. And that's how they're able to spray a certain distance. Now, if you only put one of these heads in the whole 10 gallon per minute source hose, then it would spray a really long distance up to a certain point. It would really just be, you would hit a wall with how far you can spray with this, but it's going to be overutilized. That's why you have to add multiple to match your source output. But if you do have what it's rated for, a lot of times it'll tell you on the information for your sprinkler head how far apart you can place these things. It sprays, for instance, 15 feet in either direction at 0.88 gallons per minute. If you have that information, you know that you can place these things a certain width apart. You want to have some overlap. So if it's 15 feet in either direction, you can put, and so this is going to spray 15 feet, and the next one's going to spray 15 feet. You know that your overlap of 5 feet will let you put this 25 feet away from the next one. And that a lot of times is given on the type of sprinkler head that you buy, the website that you find, or the when you buy it from the store, it's got information on it. It'll tell you how far apart you can put these things if you have that amount of output. Now, what if you don't have that amount of output? What if you only have 5 gallons per minute, but you have 10 sprinkler heads that you want to use? Well, what you'll have to do is you'll have to break your system into 2 different sections. So you can only run half of them at once. You can do this manually with a valve, cutting one off and then having to cut the other one on when you want to do that. Or you can do that automatically with automatic valves and timers, which we'll talk about in one of the other lessons. But keep in mind that the basic concept is you want to match the output of your sprinkler heads, all of them totaled together, the amount that you have, with the amount of source water that you have. If you do that, then your irrigation will function correctly, and you can place them to the specs that they have recommended. Now, for small plots of your garden, if it's just a little area, usually figuring out how many irrigation heads you need is not an issue, because you've got plenty of source water to power the amount of heads that you'll need. But for a larger plot, you need to really make sure that the amount of water that you have coming out of that hose is going to match the amount of water that is going to come out of these, or out of these, or these, or anything like that. The last bit of information that I'll leave you with is, in any types of pipes that you use, it's really a good idea to put cutoff valves. And that just takes the place, or just takes the form of these ball valves, which can open and close and just closes the amount of water that goes through, or completely closes it and opens it back up. They come in small, or they come in 1 inch size, 3/4 inch size. They come in 1.5 to 2 inch sizes. It's really just a good practice to put a few different cutoff points so that if you have an issue, you have a blowout, or you have a hose rupture, or you have a cut in your pipe in any way, shape, or form, or you need to quickly turn off your irrigation for some reason, instead of having to run back to your source and turn that off, you want to be able to shut off your water right where you need it to be shut off. Now, if you put a cutoff valve in front of this pipe can probably hold that pressure. The PVC pipe can definitely hold that pressure that's coming out of your source. But just a tip, don't put it in a pipe like this that isn't rated to hold that much pressure. If you cut this water off and your source is backing that, is forcing water into this pipe, it's likely going to explode. It's not a big deal, except you have to replace it. So just something to keep in mind there. So those are the basics of overhead irrigation. We've got where we start, how we get there, where we end, how does water come out, what pipes are we using, how do we lay out our pipes. I hope you've learned something, and I hope that with the different resources we've given you, you'll be able to pick and choose the different things that you'll need to build your irrigation system. Kind of something just I'll finish with is, don't feel like you've got to get it perfect. Really, the point is you want to just be able to have consistent water. And if it turns out that this year or next year, whenever you decide to put your irrigation system in, maybe it doesn't function 100% the way that a super efficient irrigation system could function. Well, that's the process of learning. You start with one thing, then you move on to the next thing, you improve, you continue to learn. With the resources that we've given you, you should be able to design and install a really simple and functioning system. You can also go to a hardware store or a garden center, and a lot of times they have kits that you can buy. We'll put a link to some of the kits that we have found that are very helpful. And really, it's just a matter of get out there and build it. Build something that is functional and that you have built with your own hands, so that you understand how it works and that you know how to fix it and you know how to run it when the time comes.